So the case files for the youth tend to look like this. They're filed away usually with the court system or with the probation office, depending upon where the case actually is physically now in process. And the paperwork tends to look pretty messy. It tends to have a lot of different kinds of things all attached and in various places in the file. So the first thing I do when I'm going to code a file is I take everything out and I go through the entire file. I really make sure not to move anything around in the file because I'm sensitive that this is someone else's property and they may have an organization of this file that I might not be aware of. So while I go through the file, I don't move any of the paperwork. So the first thing I do is I just literally go through and see what's in this file and check out all of the different documents, check out where they come from, check out what kind of information might be available, and then I create a master list. So if this is the correct file, I create the master list that I will use for research purposes to de-identify this file. So for example, this is now going to become 001, the name Suzanne McMurphy, and the source ID can be the court ID. It might be a family name if the child was in the child welfare system. There might be a client ID if the child had their own ID. And I write all those different source IDs here on the side so that the research ID is the only thing which then goes on my coding sheet. When I'm finished coding this particular file, then I can erase that particular line, or when I'm finished coding the entire set of case files, I can rip this sheet up, I can shred it, and then this file then becomes de-identified. It's not anonymized because there's still information in my coding sheet that will allow me to identify the youth, but I've taken away the identifiers that would breach confidentiality should this be found by someone. So the research ID of 001 is meaningless to anyone without this master list. So before we start coding the files, we create a coding sheet. And this coding sheet is essentially an interview that we do of the file. So it lists all of the kind of information that I would want to extract from this file in the form of questions. So this particular coding sheet that we use for this study is 12 pages long. And I go through this file and I use this coding sheet to answer the questions from this file. One of the reasons for using a strict coding sheet like this, rather than just allowing the information to emerge, is I want to make sure that I gather the same information from each case file. I have a lot of open-ended questions in here, so when I get to a place where I need to extract themes, I need to extract narrative data, I put that narrative data then on blank sheets that get associated with this case file. So for example, I'll start this case file after I give it the ID number of 001 that's associated with my master list, and notice that's the only identifier that goes on my coding sheet. I then begin to go through the file to see if I can find out, so where's the child now? Well, there's probably some type of intake sheet that tells me where this child might be. This intake sheet is also going to give me demographic information, so I'm going to be able to identify the gender, I'm going to be able to look at where they're living, I'm going to be able to find out what their current status is, I'm going to find out where their custody might expire. I also can find out where their living arrangements are, and if they have any dependents, and what their living situation is. So then I begin to look for things, as I said before, that are related to the themes, related to the theoretical framework that we're applying, the systems of care. So somewhere in this case file, I'm looking for things that have a lot of information, written information about the child. Those are often called assessments or biopsychosocials that identify the different kinds of factors in that child's life. There are probably several of these. There's probably an assessment that was done the first time the child came into care. There's an assessment that will have been done prior to the child being waived into adult court. And there's probably one that's being done right now in terms of the child being sentenced after they've already been processed through adult court. So I look for this kind of information and I read this information to be able to begin to answer the questions about, okay, so have they had any kind of care? What was their employment situation? What's the history of their employment situation? Have they had any kind of treatment? And if they have, I then start to make a document of So 14, they have been in school for X number of years. Types of school they've been in, vocational school, a special education school. I then look for information regarding whether or not they had any particular problems in school, whether there were any issues that the school dealt with, whether they were expelled, or whether or not they're still in school. And then I look for issues related to substance use, which is my next set of questions. So sometimes I have to go back to the beginning of this assessment and look to see whether or not there has been any kind of mental health diagnosis. Check to see whether or not there's been any treatment. And also look for the language that's used to describe this child. So was this child described as in serious need of assistance? Was the child described as having a long history of needing assistance? Was the child described as being in a context where they needed additional treatment? So I look for that kind of language as well that I put in this that I'll use later for identifying different themes that emerge. When I've finished this coding sheet, I then put all this information back into this file, and I write for myself my impressions of this file. So I write my first impressions of the file when I first started, and I write my impressions of this file now. That allows me to be really reflexive and transparent about what might have been some of my biases and what kind of filters I might have been using for gathering this information, because I'm extracting this information and I'm making choices about what's coming from this file. And so this set of impressions allows me to also document what I might have been using as my own lens or potential bias. So after we've coded all of the files, so we coded 25 files for youth who had committed the same kind of offense, who could have been waived to adult court, who weren't waived to adult court. And then we gathered data on the 88 youth that had been waived to adult court, and we separated these files into those two groupings. And then we sat down as a team and we began to identify the themes that we would use to contrast the groups that had been waived to adult court and the group that had not been waived to adult court. And because we were using a systems of care theoretical framework, we separated this into the different institutional systems where the children would have been able to get care. So we transcend now each of these individual files into then the next level of abstraction, which is where did they get the treatment and what type of treatment and what type of language, what type of metaphor, what type of description was being used in these different groups. So when we've completed coding each of these files and we have our coding sheet for each of the files, we come together as a team and we go through each one of these individual files and we extract from these files themes related to the institutional care that the youth could receive. So we've got the group of youth that committed the same offense as a youthful offender but didn't get waived to adult court, and we've got the group of youth that did get waived to adult court. So we look at those two groups separately and we extract metaphors, themes, contexts, descriptions related to those institutional treatment that each of those two different groups could have received. And we use these memo sheets as a mechanism for writing those different themes. So for example, if we look at the theme of child welfare, this is the group of youth pre-waiver. In other words, this is a group that was waived to adult court. And so we look at what types of treatment they might have received in the child welfare system up to the point at which they were waived to adult court. This is the group I call pre-offense. This was the group that committed the same kind of an offense as a youthful offender but didn't get waived to adult court. And we take a look at what kinds of treatment they may have received in the child welfare system prior to having committed that offense. So if you can imagine, this is the line at which the offense occurs chronologically. This is everything that precedes that. So the kinds of things that we're coding are, for example, did the families of the children receive any kind of support system? Did they receive any kind of supports for being an at-risk family? Did the child move to another relative and receive kinship care? Did the child go into foster care? Did the child return back to the family? What kinds of things were used as descriptions? So we're not looking at individuals, but looking as groups. Was there a substantial amount of support for these families? And as you can see by the number of memos, the group that's pre-offense had substantially more contact with the child welfare system than those that had been waived to adult court. So because we're using the theoretical framework of systems of care, we separate these into the different kinds of care that the children could have received. So here is mental health treatment. TX is a shorthand for treatment. So here's substance use and treatment there, mental health treatment and substance use here. Now, In this system of care, what we discovered was that those who were waived to adult court were substantially diagnosed with needing mental health treatment and needing substance use treatment. But you can see none of them, of the 88 cases, not a single case had received any mental health treatment. And only a couple cases had received any kind of substance use treatment. But in the pre-offense group, there was a substantial amount of mental health diagnoses and treatment provided. And so you can see the difference between these two groups by the number of memos and the different types of treatments, the different descriptions of the needs that were identified. In terms of school, you can see that every single one of our 88 cases had been expelled from school. They were no longer in any kind of schooling, education, or training. Here, the group that was in pre-offense, some of them had been in different forms of schooling, but most of them were still associated with the educational system in some way. And then comes the legislation. And the youth are either waived to adult court or not waived to adult court. So this is the group that did not get waived to adult court, even though at this point in time they commit the same type of offense. And this is the group, the 88, that did get waived to adult court. One of the reasons that the legislation was passed, and one of our parts of our analysis, was the determination of whether there was increased safety as a result of the legislation. That was the purpose, original purpose of passing that piece of legislation. So as you can see here, the group that gets waived to adult court does not go into residential treatment because they're no longer eligible for treatment within the juvenile justice system. They are now in adult institutions. That includes jail, that can be some form of adult detention, and that can also be adult incarceration. The group that does not get waived to adult court is eligible, and the majority of them go into some form of juvenile treatment. That's that TX shorthand again. What's interesting here is that the youth that get waived into the adult court, if they've gone into jail and they ultimately get sentenced for incarceration, there is good time that is counted towards that in jail. Many of them are first-time offenders in the adult court, which means that they're on probation and not being incarcerated. Youth that are in residential treatment can be in a treatment setting for up to 2 years, and in some cases up to the age of 21. So if one interprets safety as someone being sort of removed from society or removed from the opportunity to commit offenses, this group actually provides more safety because they are in a residential treatment center than this group, which the majority of went on probation, or the majority of them, their jail time counted towards incarceration, and they spent at least a third less time in any kind of setting than this group that had not been waived to adult court. So in terms of safety, the legislation did not come anywhere near being able to provide safety as we would define it as community, as a residential or out of community placement. So the two things that we found as a result of the qualitative analysis was, first of all, there was substantially less treatment being provided to these youth even before they got into the adult court system. The group that had had substantially more interaction with either treatment centers or the child welfare system did not get waived to adult court, but in fact spent more time in a residential setting than did this group. And we would never have discovered any of these themes or metaphors if we had not done the qualitative component of our analysis.